lead the afternoon, Mark McEwen, who will be taking on. He is one of the student participants or members of the Ratio Christi. So we need to bring these young people into leadership roles. So this is wonderful that he's going to be leading this afternoon. So you will meet Mark when we have our session this afternoon. All right. We have a new session, but it is an individual that you have already met, and he needs to be thanked and congratulated. I know we will at the end of our symposium, but I will take the moment as well to just once again express our appreciation to Cody and all of his vision and his determination and drive and organization for the symposium today. And he is our next featured speaker. He is a graduate from Crandall University with a science degree, a Bachelor of Science. And we don't turn out a lot of Bachelor of Science students every year. So he is in a premier group. So we want to congratulate him on that. But he has also gone on to earn a Master of Arts in Apologetics from the Southern Evangelical Seminary and is currently enrolled at Tyndale Seminary working on an MTS. And he is keeping his nose to the grindstone on that program as well. He has published on a variety of subjects related to apologetics, and that really is his heart. And you can see that in his energy as he walks the halls, as he meets with students on Thursday evenings, and of course in the symposium that we have today. Well, Cody's talk is a real interesting talk because I understand he's going to solve both the authorship of the Torah and Hebrews, saying and arguing that they're both the same. No, isn't that? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, he wasn't quite going to quite make that large of a leap. But he is going to look at the Torah, which of course we have one of the copies of the Torah here that you had an opportunity to look at. He is going to speak on who is the author behind these 5 seminal books of the Hebrew Scriptures. Who wrote it? Does the text itself or anything from an external source give validity or suggest the authorship of this part of God's Word? So Cody, I want to invite you. We prayed this morning, but I think we probably could use a refresher on that. So why don't you come forward and I'll pray and give you the opportunity to lead us through this next session. Father, we thank you for your servant here who has used the word serve and servant. He is here to serve. He's serving you, and as a result, we are being blessed. So I ask your blessing upon his words, his thoughts, and his presentation for us this morning. In your name, amen.
Well, thank you, Dr. Olhauser. Hello again. So who here is just joining us for the first time? Right? Okay, we've got a few new faces. Excellent. So, do we have that up? Perfect. Almost forgot my clicker. That's important. And it won't turn on. Awkward. There we go. Perfect. All right. So, as was just mentioned, my name is Cody J, and I have the privilege of talking to you about the origins of the Torah. They're not in the same way that Dr. Dempster did last night. He talked about the mechanical origins, the manuscript origins, how it's been copied over the years, and I'm going to talk to you specifically about the authorship of the Torah, not this particular one, the original. Right? Does anybody know what the traditional view is on the original authorship of the Torah? Except besides Dr. Dempster or Mr. Cooper? Moses, right. So the traditional view, if you were in Sunday school, brought up in Sunday school, would be that Moses wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy. And this subject of authorship of the Torah, as Dan mentioned earlier, can get a little hairy. It can get a little technical sometimes, and as I developed this talk, I wrestled with how to simplify the issues without oversimplifying it. Because there are some important technical issues involved in this. But ultimately what I want to do is I want to help each of you to be able to have an intelligent conversation about this subject without having to go to graduate school and become a Hebrew scholar. So I think I have appropriately subtitled my talk, How to Have a Conversation Without Being a Hebrew Scholar. Or we may just say, How to Have a Conversation about this without being Dr. Dempster. Now, to show my hand right off the bat, because I don't want to mislead anyone. I want you to see where we're going with this so you can track along here. I'm going to present a case as to why I think it is both reasonable and warranted by the textual evidence. I'm going to talk a little bit about external evidence, but I mostly want to focus on the internal evidence. I'll explain why in a moment. I want to talk about the textual evidence as to why we can with reason, accept some form of the traditional view of the composition of the Torah, of Genesis through Deuteronomy, which may surprise some of you because, as was once again mentioned earlier by Dan, it's very unpopular in academia today to hold to the traditional view of the authorship of the Torah, or really any traditional view having to do with the Bible whatsoever. But we are going to do our best today, in the time we have, to give a bit of an overview as to why I think we can, with reason, hold to it. So again, the traditional view is that the Torah was thought to be written by Moses, the man God used to free his people Israel from slavery in Egypt and then lead them through the wilderness into the land of Canaan, the Promised Land. Now, Moses would have supposedly written the Torah when he and the Israelites wandered through the wilderness for 40 years, about 3,400 years ago, or possibly 3,200 years ago, depending on when you date the Exodus. I'll show my hand. I kind of lean towards the earlier date, but that's neither here nor there with this discussion. But the traditional understanding of the origins of the Torah, it actually went virtually unchallenged for the most part up until the medieval period. And when we do reach the medieval period, we find cropping up some seeds of doubt concerning the Mosaic authorship of the Torah. In particular, some began to express skepticism concerning whether or not it would really make sense for Moses to have written certain passages of the Torah. For example, one of the ones I have up there is one of my personal favorites, Numbers 12, verse 3. Off the top of the head, does anyone know what Numbers 12, verse 3 says? Besides Dr. Dempster. All right, fine. Go ahead, Dr. Dempster.
Moses was the meekest man in all the earth.
Moses was the meekest, or the humblest man in all the earth. Now, this is not exactly the type of thing you would expect the most humble man in all the earth to say, is it? It would at the very least, be pretty awkwardly ironic to find the most humble man in all the earth bragging about his own humility. Now, another passage that the medieval thinkers began to doubt as being Mosaic is Deuteronomy 34, verses 5 to 12, which records the death and burial of Moses. I don't even think the great Moses was around to record his death and burial. And we also find in that passage Joshua's succession of Moses as leader of Israel after Moses died. So, understandably, you can kind of understand why they started to have doubts about the Mosaic authorship of some of these verses, can't you? Now, fast forward to the 17th and 18th centuries, and we find ourselves in the time of the Enlightenment thinkers and higher critical scholars. And these guys gave rise to what is called higher criticism, which it focused on the criticism of preconceptions and long-held beliefs or views. And in particular, there was a development of higher criticism concerning how to study and interpret the text of the Bible. And this was already talked about a little bit. But the higher critics reaffirmed the medieval doubts about whether or not certain passages of the Torah, particularly those pertaining to the humility of Moses and the death and burial of Moses and Joshua's succession of Moses, that they reaffirmed the doubts as to whether or not these could really have been written by Moses. And a number of other passages of the Torah were also pointed out as being difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile with the idea of Mosaic authorship. So, for example, one of my favorites, there's a lot of these passages, I'm just going to say right now, we don't have time to go through all of them. And I don't personally find all of them that compelling, not all of them, but what I'm going to give you is just a handful of examples that I think are among the most compelling. Okay, I'm choosing my words carefully here. Now, for example, I like this one. In Genesis 14, verse 14, there's a reference to the city of Dan. And this city did not actually bear the name of Dan until Israel conquered the city in the time of Joshua. So if Moses wrote Genesis, how could he refer to the city as being called Dan? if it was not actually called Dan at this time. There's also what we call a retrospective reference in Genesis 36, verse 51, to the kings of Israel. There weren't any kings of Israel around this time. Kings of Israel didn't show up until much later, when the Israelite monarchy was instituted, hundreds of years after the time of Moses, when Samuel anointed Saul as the first king. And there's also a retrospective reference in Deuteronomy 34, verse 10, to the prophets of Israel, with Moses being compared as the greatest prophet to have ever arisen in Israel as of the time of the writing of this verse. The verse itself actually indicates that an undisclosed amount of time has actually passed since the time of Moses and the writing of the verse. The verse itself indicates this. And then we also find that Moses is exclusively and repeatedly referred to in the third person throughout the entire Torah, never in the first person. And this kind of sharply contrasts other Old Testament texts, like, for example, the books of Ezra or Nehemiah, which we would say are written by Ezra and Nehemiah, and those are written in the first person. So the impression then is that it seems to indicate that Moses was not the author of these third-person passages, but rather it's somebody else writing about Moses. Now, again, there are many other seemingly post-Mosaic passages which led higher critical scholars to say that there was a later editor after the time of Moses, or a later author at the very least. But eventually, this actually led to some concluding that not only can we not attribute Mosaic authorship to these passages, but ultimately we can't attribute Mosaic authorship to any of the Torah. So, for example, we find the Jewish Dutch philosopher Baruch, or who's better known as Benedict Spinoza, and he listed many of these post-Mosaic passages in his book, A Theologico-Political Treatise. If you really want a book to help you get to sleep at night, I recommend that one. But Spinoza concluded, as there are many passages in the Torah that Moses could not have written, it follows that the belief that Moses was the author of the Torah is ungrounded and even irrational. Now, this was Spinoza's thoughts, not my own, but we're going to get to that. Now, Spinoza would actually go on, as would many others, into modern times, to attribute the authorship of the Torah to a later author. The latest that I'm aware of would be Ezra, living about 1,000 years after the time of Moses. And supposedly he stitched together, this later editor or redactor stitched together a variety of source documents from different Jewish schools of thought into the text we have today. Now, for the sake of time, originally my lecture included a large section critiquing these views, but then I realized that my lecture was about 2 hours long. So, for the sake of time, I'm not going to be providing a direct critique of these critical theories of the composition of the Torah, which arose out of this kind of thinking, such as the famous documentary hypothesis. Though I have researched this, I do know about it, so this isn't out of ignorance, this is just out of sake of time. But if you do want to know about this, and I'm setting myself up for a question I know how to answer here. If you do want to know about this, feel free to stick one in the question box outside the room. But I will say that as recommended reading, if you do want to know a little bit about why the reasoning behind hypotheses, or such as the documentary hypothesis, don't really seem to hold water, I'd recommend, as a good starting point, Umberto Cassuto's classic book, The Documentary Hypothesis and the Composition of the Pentateuch. He's a Hebrew scholar. I don't recommend reading the original because it was written in Hebrew, unless you know Hebrew. But there are English translations out there. But for our current purposes, we're going to press on and we're going to focus on setting forth a positive case for an alternative model for understanding the origins of the Torah. A form of the traditional position, which I believe best fits all the known data, and can also account for the seemingly post-Mosaic passages we just listed. Now, I want to refer back to Dan's talk earlier, because this is an important point. Notice I didn't say we're going to prove Mosaic authorship. Proving is a funny word, okay? The traditional views of Christians and Jews and Samaritans was always Mosaic authorship. What we have, besides direct testimony, is what we call corroborative evidence. Things that just they don't prove Mosaic authorship, but they seem to line up quite nicely. So we're going to look at some of that. And since I know that each of you have access to a Bible, we're going to focus on the internal rather than external evidence for the view we are going to set forth, because Scripture tells us to test everything, and since this is a symposium not only for the scholar, but also for the layperson, and I know that everybody here has access in some way, shape, or form to a Bible, I want you to be able to test what I'm saying today and look into it for yourself. And then also I've recommended resources for looking at external evidence, and you can also ask about that if you want during the Q&A. Now, there are at least 8 lines of internal textual evidence for Mosaic composition. And for the sake of time, I'm only going to be able to give a handful of some of what I think are some of the best examples of each, many of which I have drawn from great books like Gleason Archer's book, A Survey of Old Testament Introduction. I think that is a very good... Gleason Archer is a phenomenal Old Testament scholar, and he's a conservative Old Testament scholar. I think he does a great job in that book handling some of the critical views and giving evidence for conservative positions. But I digress. So the first 3 lines of evidence are going to be dealing with direct claims to Mosaic authorship. The first is the testimony of the Torah itself. There isn't a whole lot of direct claims in the Torah, but there are a few. And Dr. Dempster mentioned a couple of them last night. But there appear to be some explicit statements that throughout the Torah that Moses was the original author of at least some of its contents. So, for example, in Exodus, again, I'm not going to reference everything. I'm going to give you what I think are the most explicit statements. But, for example, in Exodus 17, verse 14, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in a book, and recite it in the ears of Joshua." Exodus 24, verse 4, "And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord." And the Lord said to Moses in Exodus 34, verse 27, "Write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." Numbers 33, verses 1 to 2, which I believe Dr. Dempster referenced last night. "These are the stages of the people of Israel when they went out of the land of Egypt by their companies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote down their starting places, stage by stage, by the command of the Lord." Where were these starting places written down? Oh, and these are their stages according to their starting places. And then finally, Deuteronomy 31, verse 9. "Then Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel." That's our first line of evidence. I gave you just a handful of some of the explicit statements in the Torah that seem to indicate at least some extent of Mosaic authorship. The second line of evidence is the testimony of other Old Testament writings. And there's a lot. Most of them come in the form of referring back to the book of the Law of Moses, or the Law of Moses. But there are a few other explicit statements. I'm going to give you 2 of what I think are the most direct. One comes from Judges 3, verse 4. It says, "They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses." Notice it doesn't say by the mouth of Moses. It says by the hand. I don't know about you guys, but I think that's a pretty explicit statement referring to authorship. And then 2 Chronicles 34, verse 14. "While they were bringing out the money that had been brought into the house of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord given through Moses." The book of the law of the Lord was given through Moses. Now, the third line of direct textual evidence comes from the New Testament. So this is particularly relevant for Christians, because as far as I'm aware, the Jews still hold the Old Testament as the only testament. But in the New Testament, we have several explicit statements. One comes from Mark 12, verse 19, where the Sadducees were challenging Christ about the resurrection. And they say, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife, but leaves no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." And this, of course, refers back to Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. So an explicit reference to Moses, at the very least, writing that verse. In John 1, verse 45, it says, "Philip found Nathanael and said to him, 'We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph.'" We also have a statement from Jesus himself in John 5, verses 45 to 46. Oh, there we go. Jesus said, "Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me." And then finally, Romans 10, verse 5, Paul writes, "For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them." Does anybody remember where that's out of? Besides Dr. Dempster?
It's right there.
Oh, is it? Oh. That was anticlimactic. That quotes Leviticus 18, verse 5. So, again, this is just a sampling. I actually have a whole list of all the passages. I went and did a study. This is how I get to spend my spare time as an apologist. I did a study of these types of passages throughout Scripture, looking at referring to Moses as being the author of the Torah or referring to the book of the law of Moses. I came up with something, I think I got well over 50 references throughout the entire biblical text. So if you want those, I can get them to you later. But I think the handful's fine for now. Now, these were direct lines of evidence, direct lines of textual evidence for Mosaic authorship. Not a whole lot, but again, there's not only internal, there's also external evidence. All of the earliest Christian, Jewish, and Samaritan traditions attributed Mosaic authorship to the Torah, and I don't think that we should just out of hand reject early traditions. I think we need to be a little less uncritically critical, as Dan mentioned earlier, but I digress. We're now going to look at some indirect textual evidence. And remember, what I'm about to give you doesn't prove Mosaic authorship, because again, proving is kind of a funny word, but it lines up pretty well with the idea that Moses wrote it. So, for example, there is textual evidence for the Torah having been written by an eyewitness to the events it records. So as you remember from the last lecture, Dan mentioned that, if somebody wrote the Torah 1,000 years after the time of the events it records, it's kind of odd that they have such a detailed knowledge of slave inflation prices. But I wish I did, because that would have been a great carryover, but I did not reference that in my lecture, but I thought I'd bring it up now. But I'm giving you two examples of what I think are two of the most interesting references to what we call eyewitness details, stuff that only an eyewitness would have probably known. One example, and this is my favorite one because it's hilarious, and I'll explain why in a moment. Actually, I think you'll be able to see it. One example is found in Exodus 15, verse 27, where the narrator recalls the exact number of fountains and palm trees at Elim. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. Now, ignoring for the moment how ridiculous it is that whoever wrote this took the time to sit down and count the number of palm trees in the area, like, come on, there must be something better you can do with your time. But in any case, that is ridiculous. But this detailed information about the layout of Elim at the time of the Exodus suggests that the person writing this verse was present to know how many palm trees were there. Again, somebody had to take the time to count them. I guess I don't know I don't know why they thought that was relevant, but in any case. Another example comes from Numbers 11, verses 7 to 8, where the narrator gives the appearance, texture, and taste of the manna which fell from heaven as the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. So it says in Numbers 11, verses 7 to 8, "Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil." Now, Gleason Archer notes on this passage, he says that these details about the appearance, texture, and taste of the manna were no doubt for the benefit of coming generations in conquered Canaan, where Moses knew no manna would fall. Why include details like this? For those who weren't there, so they could know exactly how the Israelites were living and what they were doing while they were just going on a soul-searching journey through the wilderness and the desert. Now, these are just two examples of what seem to be eyewitness details in the Torah. The slave inflation crises are another good one. But again, not direct evidence for Mosaic authorship, but it lines up well with the idea that he was the guy who wrote it. Fifth line of evidence is that the author demonstrates a very keen knowledge of Egypt and the surrounding areas at the time of the Exodus. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it can get very dry, pun intended, because, we're in the desert. And sometimes it can get pretty technical, so we want to avoid that today. But I'd like to summarize some of the data for you because I do think it is some very relevant internal data. Again, not proving Mosaic authorship, but as I will suggest, it lines up pretty well with it. So, for example, the author demonstrates a strong knowledge of Egyptian names, titles, and customs that would have been specific to the time of Moses. Gleason Archer has a whole list of these in his book, A Survey of Old Testament Introduction. Again, get that book for your Old Testament study shelf. I know you guys have some sort of collection of Christian books and stuff. Get this on your shelf. It's fantastic. Another point, the Torah also uses a far greater percentage of Egyptian loanwords than anywhere else in the Old Testament, as would be expected if the author had a deep acquaintance with the Egyptian language, such as Moses would have. Right? Again, doesn't prove, but lines up nicely. The books of Exodus through Deuteronomy also demonstrate a consistently foreign or extra-Palestinian viewpoint in relation to Canaan, as would be expected if the author was writing from a pre-conquest perspective, as Moses would have. So, for example, I'll give you a couple. The author describes seasons and weather patterns in Egyptian rather than Palestinian terms, as would be expected from someone born and raised in and coming out of Egypt, such as Moses. Hey, look at that. Some people are paying attention. Wonderful. And another example. The flora and fauna, which I realized yesterday as I was going over my notes. Not everybody here knows what the words flora and fauna mean, probably. As was mentioned, I did my degree in science, so I'm used to using these terms. But flora and fauna just refer to plants and animals. So we just use those terms to make it sound cooler. So the flora and fauna, which the Torah refers to, are Egyptian and Sinaitic, never distinctively Palestinian, which is very interesting. And finally, the author of the Torah demonstrates pinpoint accuracy when providing details concerning the Egyptian and Sinaitic regions, as would be expected by someone who is actually personally familiar with those areas, such as Moses. Now, again, if you're interested in looking at each of these in more detail, because there's a lot, maybe Dan or Steve can attest to this if they've looked into this too, but this is a very simplified summary of what I'm talking about on this point. There is a lot involved in this, a lot of data. I did my best to summarize it for you. But I recommend Archer's book because he has a whole list of this stuff. So our sixth line of evidence for Mosaic authorship is that the Torah is written within the context of a nomadic desert life. And Dan talked about this earlier. It doesn't reflect the context of a nation that is settled in its promised land, that is spread out and settled there. It looks like it's a unitary group migrating through the desert. That's the context we have with the Torah. As Archer notes, the atmosphere of Exodus through Numbers is unmistakably that of the desert, not of an agricultural people settled in their ancestral possessions. So, for example, not only are there repeated references to the desert, as would be expected if they're writing from the desert, but there's also a tremendous emphasis on a portable tabernacle, or a large tent, rather than a temple, which is what the Jews were known for. And this is the tabernacle, large tent, is what's being referred to throughout the Torah as Israel's place of worship, which would have been a completely foreign thought to a later redactor far removed from the supposed time of Moses, but perfectly expected for a nomadic desert tribe, from a group migrating through the desert, a portable place of worship. Also, we find in the Levitical law, Dan also mentioned that there are a lot of laws that seem to be specific for a migrating group. I'm going to give you a few of some of the ones I find are really interesting. The Levitical law gives instructions for sending the scapegoat out into the desert, which would not really make a whole lot of sense if the people were not in the desert. So, right? Why make that a law 1,000 years later when they're not in the desert? Quite the journey to do that. Another one, sanitation instructions are given in Deuteronomy 23, verses 12 to 13, that are specifically for a temporary encampment in the desert wilderness. I didn't explicitly mention what this verse is referring to. I'm going to just let you go look that up. I think Steve knows what it is, so I'm just going to let you guys go look that up. But yes, just trust me for now. It is referring to, it's a law that is written for the context of a temporary encampment in the desert wilderness, and it would not make a whole lot of sense for people who are settled and not living in the desert. But yeah, just for fun, go look up that law later. Now, another one, the exact order of march given for the people of Israel in Numbers 10, verses 14 to 20, would only have significance while the entire population of Israel was concentrated into one large group or unit and was in the process of migration. The marching order here doesn't make sense for a nation that is spread out and settled in its homeland 1,000 years later. So again, not direct evidence for Mosaic authorship, but it fits quite nicely. Now, another one I want to talk about is, our seventh line of evidence is Moses' qualifications for writing the Torah. No, I'm not talking about him having a degree from Harvard or anything. I'm talking about what made Moses the type of person we would expect to write a book like the Torah. And what I suggest is that in light of his having been a member of the royal house of Egypt and his later being handpicked as God's mouthpiece for Israel, Moses is exactly the type of person you would expect to have written a book like the Torah. So, for example, Egypt at the time of Moses had a highly cultivated art of writing. As Gleason Archer puts it in his book, quote, he says, Moses had just come from a culture in which the art of writing was so widely cultivated that even the toilet articles employed by the women in the household contained an appropriate inscription, end quote. My guess is that they were probably inscribed with either number 1 or number 2. Now, being a member of the royal family, Moses would have received from his tutors in the Egyptian court a high-class education in which Egypt at the time surpassed the rest of the world. So he would have been educated enough to write a work like the Torah. Also from his fellow Hebrews, he would have received a detailed and accurate tradition of the career of the patriarchs and of God's special revelation to them. Moses is God's spokesperson. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead here. Moses also would have had a native knowledge of Egyptian and Sinaitic climate, agriculture, and geography, as has already been mentioned as characteristic of the Torah. So again, doesn't prove, lines up nicely though. Moses as God's spokesperson to and leader for Israel would also have given him the moral and religious motivation to write the Torah, the book of God's law for his people. And finally, Moses certainly had no shortage of leisure time to sit down and write the Torah, having been wandering in the desert with the Israelites for 40 years. After all, what else is such a highly educated person as Moses going to try to do with his spare time besides write and get published? So in short, Moses is exactly the type of person we would expect to have authored a work like the Torah. Now, my eighth line of evidence that I'm going to propose to you, again, there's other lines of evidence, even internal ones, but I'm giving you some of the key ones I think that are good for you to know. An eighth line of internal evidence is the timing of the unitary completion of the Torah. I'm, again, choosing my words very carefully here. I'm not talking about every word of the Torah as we have it today. I'm talking about its completion as a unit. Internal textual indicators of some sort of unitary completion of what we call the book of the law, or the book of the law of God, or the book of the law of Moses. And throughout the Torah, particularly throughout Joshua, and then near the end of Deuteronomy, there's some special indicators that indicate that the time frame of the unitary completion of this book of the law of Moses, or the book of the law of God, was completed within Moses' lifetime. And I'm going to give you 3 of those indicators. One is that there are repeated references to a completed book of the law, or book of the law of Moses, or book of the law of God throughout the book of Joshua, placing the unitary completion of the Torah probably before the death of Joshua. Did I jump ahead there? No, we're good. Perfect. Reference is also made to the book of the law of Joshua's official succession of Moses, recorded in 1 verse 8. And this seems to be a pretty good indicator, I think, that there was a unitary completion before Joshua's succession of Moses. That's why they could reference it at his succession of Moses. And I also notice that there is an explicit reference in Deuteronomy 31 to Moses having, quote, finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end quote. And I think this is specifically probably referring to Deuteronomy, but I think that it could possibly be extended to the rest, but I think that here probably specifically referring to Deuteronomy, but in any case, these, again, not direct evidence, we're looking at some indicators here. And so we have that quote, and then Moses commands the Levites to place this book of the law into the Ark of the Covenant before they crossed over the Jordan, indicating possibly some sort, again, I'm not saying all the words of the Torah that we have today. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But there seems to be some sort of unitary completion of a basic book of the law of some sort here, being completed before the Israelites crossed over into Jordan, crossed over the Jordan into Canaan. I didn't just cross into the Jordan, that would be stupid. Now, there are therefore, I think, a good number of textual reasons, which I only gave you a brief sampling, to accept the tradition. The traditional view that Moses was what we'll call the essential author of the Torah. And this is where I start to reveal my hand a little more where I'm going with this. But again, we have to ask some questions here, because I want to say I'm not opposed to the idea that Moses may have used some earlier sources. And I'm going to give reasons for that in a moment. But at the very least, I think he probably used some earlier sources in compiling Genesis. Now, I'm not, again, we're at the symposium, this is not part of our lecture topics or anything, so I'm going to be careful how I word this. It doesn't matter what position you take on the age of the earth or whatever, but we have to admit that Genesis, at the very least, recounts thousands of years of history for which Moses was not present. So, the logical question is, where did Moses get his information from? Right? He wasn't around to be an eyewitness to those events as he would have been for the events recorded in Exodus through Deuteronomy. So, where did Moses get his information for writing Genesis? Well, the text of Genesis, I think, actually gives us a clue. So, for those of you who have read the book of Genesis, you will no doubt be familiar with the repeated phrase, this is the account or history or genealogy of so-and-so, right? So this is the account of Adam, this is the account of Noah, whatever. Now, the word translated account or history or genealogy in these passages is the Hebrew word, and forgive me, Dr. Dunster, if I'm mispronouncing this, Toledoth. Toledoth. There you go. I've been pronouncing it wrong all this time. In any case, the Hebrew word Toledoth is used in these passages. This is what's translated account or genealogy or history, and so we call this the Toledoth formula. This is a formula that's repeated throughout the book of Genesis. We actually find 12 occurrences of it, and they mark off 11 sections of the book of Genesis. 2 of the occurrences occur in a single section. So we get, this is the account or Toledoth of the heavens and the earth. This is the written account or Toledoth of Adam's line. This is the account or Toledoth of Noah, so on and so forth. Now, there would appear to be 2 possible interpretive options for this Toledoth formula. Oh, wait, sorry. Now you can see them. So there are 2 possible interpretive options to the Toledoth formula. The first option is that an author used them to organize his material, which is, perfectly reasonable interpretation. I don't see anything objectionable about that idea. But the second option is that a compiler used these formulas to indicate the documents that served as his sources. In other words, Moses was not the unique author of the material in the book of Genesis, but rather the compiler of earlier source materials into a single work, which we now call the book of Genesis. And like any good historian, he used the Toledot formulas to indicate where he was getting his information from. And I lean towards the second interpretation for what I think is a pretty good reason. Now, I mentioned that these Toledot formulas are used all through the book of Genesis, but there's a particular one in Genesis 5, verse 1, where the Hebrew word sefer accompanies Toledot, and the word sefer literally translates as book or scroll. And so we have a book or scroll contained of the account of Adam. Now, this is why in your English translations you get particular verses translated, for example, as I referenced earlier in the NIV or NLT, this is the written account of Adam's line. Or in more literal translations like the ESV, NASB, or KJV, this is the book of the generations of Adam. And I like how the Christian Standard Bible translated it, because again, I'm a little biased towards this interpretation, and this translation fits my view. This is the document containing the family records of Adam. Now, this would seem to me to be a very strong indicator of Moses' dependency on at least one earlier written source in producing the book of Genesis. And it may also indicate that the other accounts referred to throughout Genesis are themselves also different sources which Moses drew from in compiling the text. Now, I want to clarify something. The idea of Moses as compiling Genesis from earlier sources does not undermine the traditional and biblical view of Moses as the essential author of the text. For most authors, even today, draw from other sources. I drew from other sources in compiling this lecture. Does that mean it's not my lecture? No. So we know for a fact that other biblical writers drew from non-biblical sources. We mentioned already that the Old Testament refers to other texts. And we even have New Testament writers who refer to other texts, including Luke, or other sources, Luke and Jude. Jude quotes from the book of Enoch. Now, in other words, whether Moses wrote all the material in Genesis as a completely unique work, or whether he compiled it from earlier sources and included the Toledot formulas as editorial devices to indicate and connect his source text, he is still either way the composer of the book of Genesis, along with the rest of the Torah. So we have thus far suggested, okay, we're going to summarize a little bit here before we move on to my next point. We have thus far suggested that Moses should be accepted as the essential author of the Torah, of the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy, with the distinct probability of his having used some earlier sources in compiling Genesis, which covers at the very least thousands of years of history for which he was not present. However, what are we to make of those seemingly post-Mosaic passages we talked about earlier at the beginning of this lecture? What are we to make of these passages that were raised by the medieval doubters and Enlightenment thinkers? How do these passages fit with the proposal we're making today about the essential Mosaic authorship of the Torah? Well, I think the answer begins with recognizing what kind of materials we're dealing with here. Now, I welcome you guys to challenge me on this, because this is something I just noticed, and I thought that these seem to categorize themselves quite neatly, at the very least with the examples I'm citing here, but I think we can neatly categorize these seemingly post-Mosaic insertions into three basic categories. The first is what we're going to call biographical insertions. And this is information that's added to the text to give further insights into the characters of the narrative. And this would, for example, include the reference to Moses being the most humble man in all the earth. Right? That's kind of an odd thing for the most humble man in all the earth to write about himself, so we could classify that as possibly a biographical insertion. The second category of insertions, I'm going to call it narrative insertions. And this is information that's added to the text to expand on or provide elaboration in the narrative of the text. Or as Trevor Longman III has called it, glosses and elaborations. But these would include things like the information about Moses' death and burial, and Joshua's succession as Moses as leader of Israel, for which Moses was not around. Now, the third category of insertions is what we're going to call contextual insertions. This was already alluded to in a previous talk, but this would be information added to the text that helps to adjust the narrative of the text to the context of contemporary readers. So this would include things like the name of the city of Dan appearing in Genesis long before it was named such. The retrospective reference in Genesis to the kings of Israel who don't appear on the scene until hundreds of years after the time of Moses. And the retrospective reference to the prophets of Israel, with Moses being referenced as the greatest prophet. These may even include references to Moses in the third person. It may be, this is just one of the many possibilities of why we have third person references to Moses, but it may be, for example, that the text was originally written by Moses in the first person, but then someone later went in and changed all these to third person references to shift the emphasis of the text from Moses' personal perspective and journey to the broader national perspective and journey of Israel as a people. Now, personally, I'm just going to say this as a little caveat. I don't personally have a problem with the concept of Moses writing about himself in the third person. I don't, and I think other biblical authors did it as well, both in the Old and New Testament. But in any case, for the sake of the point I'm about to make, I'll leave it as a contextual insertion. But I do think that most of these passages I've listed here, with, kind of being on the fence about the third person references, I do think that these are without a doubt post-Mosaic insertions into the text. I think that is warranted by the nature of these insertions. They include information that post-date Moses, and they include things that Moses just probably would not have written. Like, it's really difficult, I'm sorry, but it's really difficult to imagine the most humble man in all the earth bragging about his own humility. Now, the question that comes to mind now, and this is where we're starting to wrap up our talk here, the question that of course comes to mind is who made these insertions? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Who made these insertions and when? Who added this material to the Torah, the book of God's law for his people? Well, as I studied this was actually one of my research focuses during my first master's degree. And there are some really boring books on this subject. So just fair warning if you decide to look into it for yourself. But one of the things I noticed that a couple of people were pointing out is there seems to be a pretty good indication in the text of at least one person who added to the Torah. Does anybody have a guess as to who it was?
Joshua.
Hey, there's a good guess. I think Dan maybe whispered it to her.
Nope.
No? Oh, man. Perfect.
Keeping my mouth shut.
All right. We got a smart one in the audience. That's great. Love it. The book of Joshua actually tells us that Joshua not only made a copy of the law of Moses, but in chapter 24, verse 26, it actually says that he added material to the book of the law of God. Now, we don't know exactly what he added, but we are told that he added something. So I just want to say, if you're hard-pressed to say that Moses wrote every single word of the Torah as we have it today, I think that you have to have a pretty good reason not to take this verse at face value. So we seem to have a pretty strong indication here that, at the very least, Joshua added something to the Torah. And coming back to my categories for these insertions, I think this would certainly account for some of the post-Mosaic material we have listed, particularly the details about the person of Moses and what took place immediately following his death. After all, Joshua was an eyewitness to the same events as Moses. And he knew Moses personally, being his assistant and all. So he could attest to things like Moses' humility. And he could also give an account of the circumstances of his death and burial, and of his then being succeeded by Joshua. Joshua adding to the Torah is also consistent with his succeeding Moses as the leader of Israel, and as God's person to talk to when needing to give a command to the Israelites. And so I think that based on this, we can conclude with some pretty good certainty, based on the textual evidence, that in adding to the Torah, Joshua probably would have been directed by the same sort of divine, and this is where I get a little theological. I think that in terms of the issue of, someone's adding to a book of the Bible. Well, we can say as Christians that we can probably safely say that Joshua was under the same divinely inspired editorship as Moses would have been in compiling the book of Genesis. So the same type of thing was going on here, I think. But okay, what about those other post-Mosaic passages? Those post-Mosaic materials that seem to even post-date even the time of Joshua. Like, for example, the retrospective reference to the kings of Israel, and who only came onto the scene hundreds of years later. Well, I think based on these references, I'm going to be very careful in what I say next, but I think based on these references, we can safely assume that there was at least one post-Joshuaic editor of the Torah. Possibly a school of editors, or a series of editors, I should say. We don't know. I think based on these texts, we can assume there's at least one later editor of the Torah following Joshua. And I don't think that we can really know with certainty with the data that we have who this editor was or when they edited the text. I have my own suspicions, and I'm not going to tell you what it is now because I'm hoping somebody will bring it up in the Q&A. But regardless, I would probably assign a particular editor to each of the three categories that I listed before. So, as I just mentioned, I think that it is most reasonable to suggest that Joshua probably made the biographical and narrative insertions, which would have made perfect sense given that he was an eyewitness of the events and he knew Moses personally as his assistant and eventual successor. It would then seem that a later God-inspired editor, or perhaps series of editors, I don't know, made some contextual insertions for their contemporaries, such as the, at the time, current name of the city of Dan. Now, if we go the route of there having been, this is just a little side note here in case you're wondering my thoughts on this, but if we go the route of there having only been one post-Joshuaic editor, we have to conclude that this editor wrote as late as after the time that the kings were instituted, because we have a reference to the kings of Israel. So if we say that there was only one editor after Joshua, you're still dating them hundreds of years later. So I digress, though. So in any case, I anticipate two possible objections to what we have proposed here today. The first potential objection is what I'm going to call giving credit to where credit is due. So one might suggest that having editors of the Torah undermines the idea of Moses being the author. But this is not the case, as editorial work only modifies or enhances a previously written work. For example, consider Dr. Stephen Dempster's book, Dominion and Dynasty. So as you can see from the cover of his book, Dr. Dempster is listed as the author. But right under his name, we have D.A. Carson listed as the editor. And no doubt, Carson may have reworded some things, or may have even inserted and or deleted some materials in the editorial process. I'm sure Dr. Dempster could tell us a bit about it. But this did not change the essential structure and message of the work, and in no way undermine the fact that Dr. Dempster was the author, that he was the essential author of the work. Consider also the book I referenced earlier, Umberto Cassuto's book on the documentary hypothesis. Cassuto's book had not only an editor, but also a translator, specifically someone who translated the text from Hebrew into English. Now, for those of you who don't know much about Hebrew, it's a very different language than English. So virtually every word of Umberto Cassuto's original text was changed. Virtually every word, albeit into their equivalents into another language. But yet, the translation of the text does not undermine the fact that Cassuto is still considered its essential author. So in all these cases, the editorial work done on these works are relatively minor compared to the overall work done by the author and have the purpose to enhance and contextualize an already written work. So in short, acknowledging that some relatively minor editorial work, at the very least, was done on the Torah following its unitary completion by Moses in no way undermines the essential Mosaic authorship of the text. All the editors would have done is what editors do today, modify and enhance the text of the author without completely changing the work. So that was the first potential objection, and I think we did a pretty good job of handling it. Good job, guys. So our second potential objection is what I'm going to call the no-touchy objection quoting the classic Disney movie, The Emperor's New Groove, which I gotta say is one of my favorites. Fantastic. Oh, sorry. Did that not work? Oh, okay. In any case, someone might point out that the Torah itself seems to quite clearly warn against adding to or taking away from its content. Some of you might have had some of these passages come to mind as I was talking. In particular, we find two warnings in the book of Deuteronomy, the first occurring at 4 verse 2. You must not add anything to what I command you or take anything away from it, so that you may keep the commands of the Lord your God I am giving you. And likewise, we have a second warning in chapter 12 verse 32. Be careful to do everything I command you. Do not add anything to it or take anything away from it. However, though at face value these seem like, oh man, what have I just suggested here? No. When we look at these passages carefully, we can see that they are specifically warning against editing God's commands. It says nothing about the narrative written in the Torah around the commands that God has given. So these passages are only instructing people not to add or take away from the passages of the Torah detailing divine commands, such as the laws. Now, if someone's really adamant about this issue, they might throw this verse at us. Revelation 22, verse 18. Which says, I testify to everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues that are written in this book. And of course, the book of Revelation is a book of no controversy whatsoever. Now, Revelation was the last New Testament book to be written, and some have used this verse at the end of the book to refer not only to the book of Revelation itself, but also to the rest of the Bible, saying that we are not to add or take away from the biblical text. Now, I'm not here going to argue one way or the other. I'm not arguing whether or not that interpretation is correct or not, because I don't think we need to in order to address this objection. Because, think about it. We just need to point out that this warning at the end of the book of Revelation is only issued at the completion of the Bible thousands of years after the Torah would have been added to by Joshua or some later editors. In other words, this warning wasn't around for them not to add to the text. At most, what we could say about this verse, at most, again, I'm not arguing for one interpretation or the other, but at most, what we could say from this verse is that the canon of Scripture, the Bible, is complete, and that we are not to modify it as of the time of the completion of the book of Revelation, the last book of the canon. So this is, at most, a warning equivalent to no touchy from here on out. That's what we have here. So in conclusion, to wrap this up, we're going to summarize here, because I know we just covered a lot of material in a very short amount of time, but these are the key points I want you to come away with of what we try to propose here. We have here argued for what we may call the essential authorship of the text by Moses. Essential Mosaic authorship. And we have given good reasons to believe that Moses, while not writing the book of Genesis as entirely unique material, compiled earlier sources with the appropriate editorial markers into this book of beginnings. And we have given good reasons, I think, to accept the traditional view that Moses was the original author of the rest of the Torah, comprising Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Again, we couldn't be exhaustive, but in the time I had, I think I gave you I think I whet your appetite to look into this a little bit further. But we've also given good reasons to accept the fact that at least two people edited the Torah in some way. Though certainly not, I don't think, to any extent which would undermine Mosaic authorship. I don't think we have evidence for that. But as I just argued, Joshua probably included some biographical and narrative materials into the Torah. And at least one later post-Joshuaic editor probably included some contextual modifiers and insertions so that the Torah would be a little more accessible to his contemporaries. Now, I think this proposal honors the earliest traditions concerning the authorship of the Torah. And I think it's based on and consistent with the text itself. And I don't think what I propose here today should produce any theological hang-ups for Christians. I really don't. I think that I will say I am generally very conservative in my theology, and I really don't think that what I propose here today is anything approaching the line of heresy. But I'd like to close here with a quote from Tremper Longman III and Raymond B. Dillard, commenting on the issue of the authorship of the Torah. They write, is that there? Perfect. The issue is one that has severely divided conservative scholars from others. The focus of the debate is over Mosaic authorship. Debate, though, may be too strong a word, since non-conservative scholars quietly ignore those who still defend a traditional viewpoint on authorship. In fairness, it must also be said that conservative Christians have been too quick to distance themselves from the possibility of sources and too close to any evidence of significant post-Mosaic activity. In the final analysis, it is possible to affirm the substantial Mosaic authorship of the Torah in line with the occasional internal evidence and the strong external testimony, while allowing for earlier sources as well as later glosses and elaboration. It is in keeping with the evidence to remain open and non-dogmatic concerning the particulars of the composition. For instance, what is pre-Moses, Moses, or post-Moses. In any case, our concern is the final form of the text, since that is what God has given the church as canon for its edification. And I believe that what we propose here today falls in line with the essence of this statement. Now, if you'd like to look into this issue further, I'm going to leave the short list of some recommended readings up on the slide for a few minutes, so you can jot them down if you'd like to look into this further for yourself. But my hope is that as we move forward in the discussion surrounding topics such as these, we will not be so quick to reject out of hand the long-held traditional views within the faith community throughout the centuries and millennia. Rather, we should be willing to seriously consider the positive evidence concerning whether or not there may be something to these long-standing beliefs. However, we must also be careful not to be dogmatic about the finer details for which there is no explicit mention in the information that we have. Particularly for Christians, let us also keep in mind that the most important issue here is not that Moses is the author behind the Torah, though because I think it's a matter of truth, I do think it has some importance. But I think the most important thing here is to remember as Christians that God himself, through the process of divine inspiration, is the ultimate mind and author behind it and the rest of Scripture. So that what we have here is not merely the words of man, but also the Word of God. And if God thought it important enough to produce and preserve this special revelation for us, we should deeply and passionately care about what it says and where it came from. And we should want to know everything we can about it. My hope is that what we discussed here today has not only challenged you to think critically and openly about these things, but has also encouraged and inspired you to dig deeper and gain a better understanding of the faith communicated to us in this collection of documents we call the Word of God. So I am just going to invite Dr. Olhauser back up to close us off, and thank you for your time.